Tomoya Asano and his team, accurately labeled Team Asano, has always been one of my favorite RPG development teams. To keep their history brief, basically, Mr. Asano joined Square Enix in 2001, where he went from working on a random assortment of Japanese-only games, to producing a few Final Fantasy remakes and spin-offs, to being in charge of his own development team within his creative business unit, to now, very recently, being appointed an executive officer at Square Enix. Needless to say, this bodes very well for the future of this team, and I am so excited for what games they have in store for the future. And I figured, what better way to both celebrate my 10 subscriber special and this team by ranking all of the games they've been in charge of and or produced. Unfortunately, I have not played the 3D DS remakes of Final Fantasy 3 and 4, so I will refrain from ranking those ones, even if I have generally heard really positive things about the both of them. As well as any of the mobile games that they've put out, such as Various Daylife, Octopath Champions of the Continent, or any of the Bravely Default ones, because once again, I haven't played them. In writing the script for this video, I also found out about this Japanese-only horror game for the Wii, Ikenai no Yoru, where you use the Wii remote as a flashlight and a cell phone to hunt ghosts. Neat. But I also will not be ranking that one for obvious reasons. Starting off with the only game in the repertoire that I actively dislike, I gotta give last place to the original Octopath Traveler. While I know that this game has become a little more controversial since the release of its sequel back in 2023, you can trust that I've been a hater since the beginning. While it's by no means my least favorite game in the entire world, and there are some elements and concepts introduced here that I do really like, it just as an overall package does not work for me in the slightest. To start things off, the pacing in this game is actually atrocious, both the gameplay and the cutscenes. The cutscenes themselves are just so long. I'm not at all opposed to a story-heavy game, but I just feel like there needs to be an actual story being told. All of the cutscenes in this game are just the most 45-minute nothing burgers setting up the chapter's dungeon. There's no reason that these scenes cannot be cut in at least half and still be able to retain literally all of the important information and character moments. It feels like there is literally so much dialogue for no other reason than just for the sake of it. And while you always can just skip the cutscenes, trust me, I did on my second and third playthroughs, the actual gameplay itself is really not that much better either. After each feature-length film in the chapters, you get to play through a 10-minute dungeon with maybe one or two divergent paths for a chest. And if you know what you're doing at all, or took a few minutes and messed around with your party composition, as well as the fact that the level scaling on a lot of the chapters is pretty off, you will almost always kill the boss in the first few turns. So for every 15 minutes of actual gameplay, there's like twice that of cutscenes that I frankly just don't care about. The world map that you have to walk through to get to different towns to do the chapters is also incredibly boring and tedious to walk through. There's really nothing to explore, no real secrets or anything, you're just walking through with an incredibly high encounter rate. And while I do not mind the high encounter rate when the combat is fun, I really did not have much fun here. The whole system of having 4 of the 8 travelers in your party really creates for a lot of times where 1 or 2 of your party members are just so much higher level than every enemy you will fight in both the world map and the chapter dungeons. And none of the characters really play in an interesting way or have interesting abilities, at least in my opinion. I mean, sure, you've got your basics, but really that's all it feels like, just basic. It's the epitome of a game where you find one strategy that kind of works and use it on every single enemy and every single boss. It's just not fun to me. Like I said, however, there are some things that I do really like. I think the break and boost system is incredibly solid. I feel like that itself adds a decent bit of depth to the combat just because of how you have to play around the turn order trying to manipulate yours and the enemy's decisions, as well as the subclass system giving just enough customization while at the same time allowing the characters to retain their main identity with their main class. I also love how a lot of the side quests utilize each traveler's path actions and battle skills on the overworld in towns. It actually is one of my favorite side quest systems in any RPG, but at the end of the day, these few positives really don't outweigh the negatives. It's like they went into it with the idea to make it pixel art's old-school JRPG without actually putting in the work or including anything that made old-school JRPGs work and be fun to play. Luckily, this is the only game on this entire list that I actively dislike and think is a bad game, so excuse me for venting out all of my frustration so early on and in such high quantity. I do not think that Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light is a bad game, but I do think it is a weird game. To start things off, I think the main customization system is very unique. Not in a bad way for sure, but just very different. I kind of like how it's involved in the sense where you have to manage your different crowns, aka jobs, classes, whatever you want to call them. It starts off pretty micromanaging at first because you're kind of limited in your resources, and I really like that. Do you want to level up the class and unlock new abilities using the gems, or do you want to sell the gems so that you're able to afford more powerful weapons and armor? But this very quickly goes out the window when you start making a lot more money later on in the game. You can kind of have your cake and eat it too. but I still think it's kind of solid. I like how you really don't know a lot of the abilities for each crown and how they'll work and come into play, and it was a joy upgrading them and learning new things. But I just feel like it set a pretty strong precedent early on, and it really doesn't keep up the pace. The battle system is also decent. Not my favorite, but it works. A little on the easy side, but not the most trivial game I've ever played, far from it. It's one of those games where it's really easy to break it with different combinations, but it's not really satisfying to do so when a lot of the brokenness can kind of feel one note. Like, it doesn't make me feel smart for making overpowered strategies when it really just feels like they're laid out in front of me. It also feels really gimmicky how the combat is very automatic. The skills just attack a random enemy, and when you heal, it just targets a low HP ally. Yeah, it's novel for sure, but this novelty kind of wore off for me pretty quickly. I do think that the combat and customization systems works and can kind of be pretty fun when you have your whole squad together. But like, none of these characters like each other and are always splitting up for whatever reason. It's like, holy crap, why is this game so obsessed with having the party split up? This is like the worst thing that a class-based RPG can do. I love the customization in these kinds of games. Experimenting and playing around with different combinations and synergies on my characters is always just a blast. But when in this game, the characters are just never together, and it feels like over half of the game is spent having 2 or maybe 3 characters. It just feels so limiting in a way that is genuinely no reason for it to be. The restrictions are just in place for the sake of it. I really think 4 is the magic number in a game like this because it allows for just enough customization and experimentation, while at the same time limiting you in a way that makes the boss fight strategic and interesting. But when you're playing through so much of the game with just 2, it kinda just feels like you need someone that can do damage and someone who can heal. I don't know, I definitely don't hate this game, I really don't. But objectively, I don't think it's very good. I do think a lot of the merit here comes from the fact that it was very interesting to see what would later become Bravely Default, because holy crap, you can really tell. But as a standalone title, I don't think it's that great, and would really only recommend if you're a huge Bravely fan who wants to see that game's history. I feel kind of weird about ranking Live Alive, because at its core, it is really not a Team Asano game in any sense of the word. They were just in charge of this remake of this 1994 SNES RPG, and it is pretty much just a one-to-one remake, so it's not like they had literally anything to do with the systems, story, or overall gameplay loop and experience. But when you go on their website or any of their social media pages, it is very much included in their lineup, so if they included it, I guess it's fair that I include it as well. My opinion on this game is generally positive. I definitely think it's a very good video game for sure. But at the end of the day, it is just so far removed from everything that I personally like about RPGs, so it's kind of hard for me to consider myself a fan. For those unaware, Live Alive is separated into 8 separate bite-sized RPGs that all take place in a different time period within the same world, with each one having their own unique take on the gameplay elements that fit into the game's overall battle system. And when I call them bite-sized, I mean that in the most literal way possible. They maybe average out to being like an hour long each. And while I do completely see what the original developers were going for here, it just wasn't enough for me. It kind of felt like I was playing through 8 separate demos for larger games. I kept feeling like I was starting up a section, had the groundwork laid out for me, and just as soon as I was starting to get into it and have fun, it was already over. I'm very much the kind of gamer who prefers much meatier experiences that I can really sink my teeth into, and this game is just the farthest thing from that. Which is definitely not to say that I didn't like them, because I absolutely did. While I for sure think some of them were better than others, for instance my personal favorites are probably Present Day, Distant Future, and Edo Japan, I really cannot bring myself to say that any of them are bad. It's pretty cool that in a game like this I can call all 8 experiences really good, but when at the end of the day, the best thing that I can say about a game is, well, that was kind of neat, I really can't say it's my favorite game in the world. I guess what I really mean to say is that I really respect this game, and I think it is an incredible piece of JRPG history that went on to inspire so many more games, like the Octopath Traveler series and even Undertale, and I definitely think it is worth experiencing in that regard. Especially because you can easily finish it in under 10 hours. But, as an RPG, it just really doesn't do that much for me outside of that novelty. The fact that I have to place Triangle Strategy this low on the list, I think really speaks for the quality of the rest of the games on here, because I think this is a pretty darn good game. And I think overall, this is where things start to get really good. I'll admit that at first, I kinda did have some mixed thoughts on this one, mainly due to the overall customization and character progression systems, or, I mean lack thereof. I've mentioned that I'm someone who loves RPGs for their vast strategic viability, and love games that really focus on the customizability of the characters and the overall team setup. And this game doesn't really have any of that. Aside from the individual skills that characters learn as they level up and promote, and their weapon trees that you unlock stat upgrades and bonuses with, there really isn't that much here in terms of player input on the individual characters. However, over the course of my several playthroughs to go through all of the different paths, I've realized, for what it lacks in those aspects, it makes up for it with the sheer amount of quality baked into each character and map. This game excels at what it sets out to do, and even though it is not usually my kind of preference in games, I completely respect it here, and I had such a good time with it. Each and every character is given such an identity through their stats and movesets. While I might not be able to really get into the nitty-gritty of it all, and customize things to my liking, I can see that this was done for a reason, as to bring out the strengths of these characters and the overall design of the game on top of it. And I think a lot of the fun here with this system comes from the fact that these characters are just so unique, and more importantly, fun. You've got things like the Carpenter, who can create ladders and traps all around the map to help allies and hinder enemies. A Clown Girl who creates shadow clones of herself. An Ice Mage who creates walls and slippery ground. A Shaman who controls the weather, or even a Clairvoyant who can alter time and space on the battlefield. And these are just a few of the 30 playable characters that this game gives you to have fun and be strategic with. And of course, while not all of them are created exactly equally, this game's expertly crafted map design brings out situations where every single one of them gets their chance to shine. While a character might not be great on one map due to how their abilities affect the enemies and the environment, they might be absolutely crucial in the next one. And due to the fairly difficult nature of this game, it always felt like I, as the player, really have to consider the layout and think strategically about who to bring, how to play, and what to do in order to succeed in the many challenging battles. I also think that the map design is some of the best I've ever seen in a strategy RPG before. Because of the way that so many of the characters work and interact in a way that affect the environment, it really feels like they went to work overtime to create individual and unique experiences for pretty much every single one of the maps. They're all just so unique, and a lot of them have really interesting and fun victory conditions. They're almost as fun to see and play on as the characters are to play. And I found that the gameplay was expertly paced here as well. It feels like you are always unlocking a new ability on a character, and it is always such a blast to find out what they do and start considering how it might work in tandem with your other characters. And while I complained about the lengthy cutscenes in Octopath Traveler, I kind of think this game has a similar amount. But unlike that game, I really found this to be one of the best stories I've ever seen told in a video game. It's crazy how much more lenient I'm willing to be when there's an actual story being told. I was always on the edge of my seat, and the way that the Scales of Conviction is integrated into the story was just so cool for me, and it is just a joy to play through it over and over again to see how the different options play out. And the way that each of the many playthroughs necessary to see and unlock everything flow into one another is just done so well. An individual playthrough is never that long, and everything like levels, characters, weapon trees, etc. all carry over to each New Game Plus that you start. And I know you're probably thinking, well, doesn't having all of the high-level characters on a new playthrough really trivialize the game? And the answer is no, it doesn't, because the developers really accounted for you doing this. Every New Game Plus, the enemies' levels scale higher, having new abilities and better stats. While on your first playthrough, the recommended level of the map might be like 15, for the subsequent one, it might be like 47. And because you'll probably be playing through a different route and choosing different options on the scales, you'll get to play a whole array of new maps on a new playthrough as well, so it never feels like you're starting over. It just feels like the game continues on for as long as you need it to. The really only negative thing I can say here is that the enemy AI can be kind of, well, really dumb. It's not so bad that it ruins the game, but it's also not so insignificant that it isn't worth mentioning. There were quite a few times that instead of feeling like I had to think strategically in a way that the game intended me to, I felt like instead I was just trying to outsmart the enemy AI, which could be kind of disappointing. But yeah, still a great game, and I absolutely think anybody who's a fan of strategy games would be blown away here. Bravely Second, the direct sequel to the original 3DS game, is a wonderful game. It is also, without a doubt, my least favorite Bravely Default game. That's not to say I don't love it, I still absolutely do. I mean, you heard how much I hyped up Triangle Strategy, and this is even higher than that. And I'm just putting that out there now because I probably won't be talking too much about the stuff I do like here in order to not be repetitive in the later sections of this video. I'm more so going to use this segment to talk about why I think it isn't exactly the greatest sequel in the world. First of all, and I cannot believe that me, of all people, is saying this, but this game has too many classes. Okay, maybe too many isn't the right phrase, but I definitely don't think they're implemented in the best way that they could be. You take the original game with their 24 classes, and that's a decent number. But while Bravely Second does drop 6 of these, it adds 12 whole new ones, adding up to total to 30 classes. On paper, I know that more sounds better, but when this game is already a lot shorter than the original, squeezing in that many more in such a shorter experience really kind of makes it feel sort of muddled at times. In order to make them all fit in this shorter game, they had to streamline a lot of these classes. In the original, each class went up to level 14, meaning that each one had 14 different abilities, be it their active skills or their passives, while the classes in Bravely Second only go up to level 10, meaning that there are only 10 skills per class. And when you take away 4 whole abilities from every single class in the game, it really feels like each one has so much less of an impact. And I think it also doesn't help that I'm not exactly the hugest fan of a lot of the new classes. Like, sure, there are some great new ones here, like the Wizard, Hawkeye, or Exorcist, that I love, but on the other hand, I really don't care for things like the Bishop, Catmancer, Patissier, or Charioteer. And while I do appreciate them getting really creative with these new classes, and that they aren't just the standard yada yada yadas, I kind of feel like because there are more here that I don't like compared to the original, it sort of feels like their inclusion takes away from the ones that I really do like. Basically, what I mean is that I wish the ones I liked were more fleshed out at the cost of maybe not including the ones I really don't. Another big thing that I'm not as huge of a fan of here is the bosses themselves. There really aren't that many of them, at least compared to the original. I know a lot of people aren't really the hugest fan of the last third or so of the original, but in its defense, it creates for so many great and challenging boss fights. And there really just aren't that as much here. Boss fights are one of my favorite parts of RPGs just due to how they can really push the player to really think and act strategically. So naturally I always am going to gravitate to the games with more bosses. And it would be one thing if it was quality over quantity, but I really don't think you get that much quality here either. Outside of the final section of the game, and a lot of the Nemesis fights, I don't really care as much for a lot of these bosses in this game compared to the other two. And maybe that's just the result of me not really liking a decent bit of the classes in this game as much comparatively, so creating a team setup or unlocking a new one isn't as much of an exciting venture this time around either. And once again, it's not to say that these are bad or I don't like them, but I definitely have no problem with saying I prefer the bosses in this game the least by far. I do think this game does some things better than the original for sure. For instance, the amount of quality of life enhancements compared to the original is absolutely crazy. For instance, being able to save composition presets is amazing. The introduction of chain battles to level things easier is also really cool. And when it's good, it's really good. But, just at the end of the day, a lot of my thoughts on this game just boil down to it being the original Bravely Default. If everything was just kinda worse, even if it's slightly, it's still enough. But I do want to reiterate that, even with everything I said, it is still absolutely one of my favorite games. But just comparatively, it does not quite stand up there with the other two, at least in my opinion. I am very happy to say that I am a big fan of Octopath Traveler 2. Unless you've been skipping through this video, you're probably well aware that my thoughts and feelings on the original are pretty far from positive, for the most part at least. I wasn't too excited at the reveal of this game, but I did kind of follow along with the pre-release marketing. I even really only played this game out of obligation. But as I was playing, I noticed that I was actually having fun. Not just any amount of fun, but a lot of fun, actually. And it's not like I didn't expect that it might be a little better, but frankly, I was shocked about how much of an improvement it actually was. It felt like every single complaint I had about the original had been completely rectified. I was having so much more fun with the battle system. I really liked a lot of the abilities and how they interacted with each other. I think the individual character classes were greatly improved. The customization and overall character progression also felt a lot more in-depth, and a little expanded upon. The boss fights are actually downright incredible in this game as well. So many of the chapter bosses, be it an early game or late game boss, they are just so well designed. They all have interesting abilities, and it is always such a blast to figure out their rotations and weaknesses in order to take them down. And the final boss? Woo! Without spoiling anything about it, I really have no doubts about calling it the best final boss in any game I have ever played. The world itself is also just so much better here as well. So much to explore, many secrets to find, be it powerful gear, items, quests, or even things like new or extra subclasses for your team. The introduction of the day and night cycle really also adds to this. It is just so much fun to explore the world map and even different towns during both the day and night portions because it is just so rewarding from a gameplay perspective. I also think that the pacing was a lot better here as well, thank God. Chapters are now not so regimented as they were in the original. They are all forced to be, character shows up to town, gets exposition dump, and then 15-minute boring dungeon. They're allowed to breathe and be their own thing for the most part. Sometimes a chapter might just be a dungeon, or an interactable cutscene. Some have multiple parts across the world now, while some might just be a passive thing that you have to earn or do while focusing on other things. It just feels so much more varied, and I didn't feel slogged down by the tedious formula at all. The dungeon design is also so much better. They are more varied and they're fun to explore with branching paths, while also not falling into the trap of having you play through annoying puzzles. They are strictly focused on the combat and the exploration. And when the combat is also just tons more fun on top of all that, the loop just becomes that much more fun to play. And I mentioned that there were things I liked about the original, mainly the path actions and side quests, and how the character classes were integrated into the non-combat portions of the game. And this is another thing that benefited from the new thing in hindsight. This felt like it added yet another layer of depth to the loop and the side quests in the series, and they still remain some of my favorites in any video game, just because of how they're integrated so well. And I think the most impressive part about it all is that they really didn't need to do any of this. I mean, it's not like the original game did bad by any means, be it critically or financially. They very well could have just released basically the same game with different characters and a new coat of paint, and I'm sure it would have done just as good as it did. But it is this commitment to the game that really endears me even more. Their absolute focus on crafting a better experience, through figuring out what didn't work about the original and weeding some of that out and rebalancing it. What did work about it and greatly expanding on those aspects, and combining all of these factors together into creating one of the best RPGs of that year. There are still a few things that I'm not exactly a huge fan of, however. For one, while the level balancing scaling was definitely improved, there still is that problem of trying to balance all of the Traveler levels, and how there are a lot of times when one character is just a much higher level, and it can kind of make the game easier than it needs to be in a lot of places. But it is a little better. But I am hoping that's a big thing that they focus on for the inevitable third game. I will be the first to admit that at times, Bravely Default 2 can sort of be a little rough around the edges. But I will also be the first to tell you that when you get into it, Bravely Default 2 is one of the most fascinating, exciting, and just genuinely well-crafted RPGs of the decade. While I know it catches a lot of flack for not being the direct follow-up to the 3DS duology that everyone was waiting for, I truthfully believe it is right up there next to the original in regards to literally everything else, and even surpasses it in some ways. To start things off, I think the loop here is absurdly good. It follows the formula of the first half of the 3DS games, where each chapter you head to a new region, and take out all of the baddies plaguing it, acquiring their asterisks or job classes along the way, and being able to equip it onto your characters. And as you level up each individual asterisk on one of your characters, you unlock new abilities and synergies you combine with a subclass on each one, as well as several passive slots allowing for you to combine even more classes together. And when all 4 characters are completely evenly statted across the board, there's no limit on what team composition you can or cannot create, aside from your own imagination and what you're able to come up with as a strategy as the player. It is incredible. You could have a red mage / Bastion, allowing for a character that can both heal, dish out a decent bit of damage, while at the same time being tanky enough to take a few hits. Or a shield master / Bastion, focusing all in on being both incredibly defensive, while also being able to tank hits for your low HP allies, and with the recover passive, gaining BP in the process. Or a Phantom / Ranger. While your damage might be sort of low here, the guaranteed status effects that comes when you combine these two allow for so many openings for your allies to deal damage. And I kind of think this is where Bravely Default 2 succeeds where Second kind of fails, because they fall back a little bit on the number of classes. There are less, sure, but that means you get to spend more time with each of them. And the fact that they're all allowed to have more abilities again now gives each one of them much more of an impact. And I can just go on and on and on and on and on about all of the different combinations and synergies and just overall fun that you can have playing around with this system, but this video is already long enough. And when you pair this with the equally great Brave and Default system that needs no introduction, which already adds even more depth to this already incredibly deep game, it makes for some of the most fun I've ever had with an RPG battle system. It is even more cool that enemies, both bosses and random encounters alike, have access to this system. It turns every single battle into a strategic experience where you really need to think. I am not joking when I say that there are random encounters in this game that I had more fun with than entire boss lineups in other games. Another thing I really appreciate about this game is its difficulty. It is hard. and I mean really, really, really hard. There was a part of me before this game came out that was actually pretty worried that my many playthroughs and extensive knowledge of the 3DS games were going to allow me to really cakewalk through the game without much resistance. But luckily, by the time the first demo came out and playing through the original Chapter 1, that worry was completely squashed. And it's definitely not like the 3DS games were easy by any means. I still find them to be more difficult than your average RPG, but Bravely Default 2 is one of the hardest games I have ever played, especially on my first blind playthrough. There were more than a few times that I thought, how the hell am I ever gonna beat this game? In fact, I can even count on one hand, with a few fingers left over, how many times I actually beat the boss on the first try, and that fact alone endears me to this game more than you could ever possibly realize. Even on repeat playthroughs, I still get my ass kicked all over excellent. And due to how the class system operates, it never feels like, oh, I'm stuck, I can't win, it's not fair, etc. It's a joy to try and reconfigure your setup after each loss, finding out what works, what doesn't, and how to optimize your equipment to allow for victory. You come up with so many setups and strategies during this reconfiguration phase in an attempt to beat a boss you've been stuck on for hours, and while some strats you come up with might not be the best for the current one, it is always in the back of your mind for later. Field bosses you find scattered across the world map are also incredible. Each one of them can be battled at any time, and while some of them are incredibly out of your league when you find them, you get better rewards based on how quickly in the game you're able to take them down, due to the fact that they have some sort of super weapon or armor that unlocks even more skills or abilities on your character. The sooner you're able to beat it, the earlier on in the game you're able to give an access to an incredibly strong piece of gear. But on the opposite hand, if you wait until the end of the game to beat it, that piece of gear might have just gotten outclassed by that point. This just adds even more than I love to the loop. New things like the equipment weight system and the chance to be targeted stat really just even add more stuff that I love. It gives you so much more to think about when going to a new town and trying to buy armor for your characters than just which has the higher stat. You gotta think about stuff like, is my character gonna be too weighed down now to act as quickly as I need them to? Or is their targeting stat too high for them to be able to survive many turns on the battlefield? The stuff that it adds here over the original Bravely Default almost makes me cry. I think it is just so good. The boss design here is also fantastic. I have no problem in saying that this game's bosses are the best of the entire series. They are so well designed, all of them. Each one is tailored completely differently. You need different team compositions and strategies for all of them. If I think of my top 10 favorite boss fights in an RPG, I think at least half of them are going to be from this game alone. The only thing I don't love about them is how they're all just pretty much one and done for the most part. You fight each boss alone and they pretty much never come back. For example, in the original game, in like Chapter 1 you might fight the Black Mage by himself. In Chapter 6, you now have to fight the Black Mage, the White Mage, and the Monk together. And then in Chapter 7, you have to fight the Black Mage, the Solve Maker, the Summoner, and the Conjurer at the same time. It was so incredibly awesome fighting all the different combinations and seeing the enemies' synergies working together and trying to combat that with your own team. And almost every single boss fight in the original, at least in the late game, is like this. While I think in a vacuum the bosses in Bravely Default 2 are so much better, I very much prefer the team fights where we have to deal with all the abilities from all of the classes at once. But basically, I was just so in love with this game, and I was even more excited for the patented Bravely Default second half, where the game transfers more from a traditional RPG experience to more of a boss rush game when you have all the classes. There really aren't that many more dungeons, but you just get to fight incredible boss fight after incredible boss fight after incredible boss fight, all while getting stronger and stronger and finding out more strategies you can use. I was waiting for it, I was waiting for it, I was waiting for it, and then credits rolled and the game ended. It never came. To say I was disappointed would be an understatement. At the point where the 3DS games really start to open up and are just the overall favorite part of the series for me, it's just not here. There is just so much less content here that it isn't even funny. Sure, I think the bosses on their own are a lot better here, but on any day of the week I will take a ton of maybe 8 out of 10 bosses, rather than a fourth of that, but they're all 10 out of 10 bosses. You get the last asterisk and head to the final boss, then that's it. In fact, I didn't even really realize that I was fighting the final boss until the character's special theme started playing during it. The game just ends so suddenly, and it hurt even more because the series had built up the reputation of its endgame acting in a certain way. I mean, sure, there are a few trial fights that qualify as these endgame fights, and while they're for sure incredible, don't get me wrong, there's only like 5 of them though. and beating them grants you even more abilities. And it's like, cool, but what is the point? This is the last thing you're ever going to do in this game. You compare this to the literal dozens upon dozens of endgame fights in the original, and it just feels so bad. And spoiler for the end of video alert, this is why this game is still under the original, even for all of the praise and love I have for it. The only other thing I really don't like here compared to the original is how a lot of the class abilities really skew more towards actives rather than passives. And this is something that I think the 3DS games really had a better balance. I mean, they're still there for sure, but there are just kind of a lot less of them, and I feel like that creates for less composition in the long run. Okay, so I know I talked a lot here, but basically my final verdict is that this game is incredible. Even better than the original in a lot of ways. It's designed so tightly, and I believe it is one of the most well-crafted games created in a long, long time. But there is just not enough content here compared to the originals, so it's kind of hard for me to prefer it, especially since the series had previously done extremely well in this regard. I would take a slightly less tight game that allowed for more fights than the bare minimum. Wow, this section really went on for a while, didn't it? Surprise! Bravely Default is my favorite game on this list. Bet you didn't see that one coming based on how I talked about the other two. But seriously, the original Bravely Default is one of my favorite games of all time. It actually was my favorite for the longest time, until, well, maybe I'll save that one for the 100 subscriber special. If I'm being completely honest, I pretty much covered everything I love about this game in the Bravely 2nd/Default 2 sections of this video, as much as I tried not to. I mean, you heard about how I talked about Default 2 and everything I loved about that one, as well as how I compared it to the original. And outside of a few tweaks to the battle system, as well as what I mentioned in regards to some of the skill distribution and boss situation, the games are pretty similar. So in order to not rehash what I just got finished talking about, I figured I'll instead share my experience with this game on a more personal level. It's incredibly special to me, and I want to do it justice rather than having this section just be a footnote at the end of the video. To start things off, way long ago, in the before times, I really wasn't that big of an RPG guy. And that's crazy to hear myself say now, because that's almost exclusively what I play anymore. Sure, I played your Pokemons, your Fire Emblems, your Personas, and I liked them well enough, but that was it really. I didn't really have much interest in the genre outside of those, and I wouldn't have even called myself a fan at the time. I was much more interested in your average live service slop or big first-party Nintendo releases. But I always did love my 3DS. It was around the time I had my first job and money of my own to spend, and I could actually buy games that I wanted when I wanted, rather than waiting for something like my birthday or Christmas money. And what I wanted were 3DS games. Even to this day, I'm not 100% sure why that's where my mind went. I think it was partly because I really liked the console and wanted to say I had a nice collection for it. That and the fact that it wouldn't be long before it was time for me to head off to college. I wasn't bringing on my PC, as I had to share a room, and I wanted to make sure I at least had my 3DS for when I wanted to game. So I might as well start building up some sort of collection now. So I just did what any normal person would do. I looked up good 3DS games on Amazon and added a bunch to my cart. I think the only reason I even put Bravely Default in there was because when I saw it, I was reminded of a friend I had on 3DS Network and how literally every time I opened my 3DS and saw that he was playing that game, come rain or shine. And I guess I figured I might as well see what the fuss was about. It really was never something that I was outright planning to play, let alone even finish. But I did end up popping it into my 3DS a week or so after it came just to try it out. My initial reactions were that it was kind of interesting. I did think that it was weird that unlike in Persona, you chose all of your character's actions at the start of the turn, and battles played out based on the character's speed stat. All of the numbers and menus were also really confusing as well, and for a while I was extremely overwhelmed. It just didn't click with me. But what I also found interesting was the world itself, and I think that's the only reason I stuck with it, because of the way that the story immediately hooked me. The actual mechanics and battle system of the game might have been going over my head for the first little part, but I was willing to stick with it and really try to learn, because I really wanted to see what was next. I was empathetic towards Tiz. I was interested in Anya's situation. I thought Ringabel was so freaking awesome. And Adia, well, I just liked her from the beginning. I wanted to see what was going to happen to these guys. I even read the entirety of Dee's journal before the prologue was even over, and I feel like seeing that play out alongside the course of the game really added to the intrigue and the mystery for me. And I really did stick with it. Even though I was getting demolished on normal difficulty, I stuck with it. And after a while, as things started to click with me and all of the numbers and menus that once seemed like a foreign language, suddenly making a whole lot of sense. I was like, oh, equipping a sub-job means I can also use that class's abilities. Yes, I was that dumb. While this was far from the greatest starter RPG for a guy like me, and there were a lot of times that I spent literal days, maybe even a week, on just one boss fight, and there were a few times where I did get discouraged and almost wanted to give up. But I didn't. I learned, I grew, and I conquered. When you're stuck against Lester DeRosa for a week, back against the literal wall, and what you're doing isn't even remotely working, you really have no choice but to get creative. Trying to use classes you really hadn't had up to that point, combine classes together in just an effort to make a dent in him, and eventually, you win. And that is the greatest feeling in the entire gaming world, when you finally take down that boss you thought you would never beat. And as I got through the game, collecting the asterisks, and actually starting to use my brain when it came to combinations and synergies, I realized that I was having more fun than I ever had in any video game I had ever played. It almost made me feel smart. I was like, aha, if I equip this subclass to this job, as well as add in this passive from this class to cover this weakness, voila, I'm a mathing. And I kept progressing. I made it all the way to what I thought was the end of the game. Finally awakened the 4th crystal, collected all of the asterisks, and ready to enter this holy pillar and fight whatever final challenge the game might throw at me. Huh? Well, suddenly, I was back at the beginning of the game. I had played this game completely and utterly blind, so I was just as lost as the characters at this point. But I had come this far, so there was no quitting now. I traveled across the world again, this time much faster with an airship, and fought all of the bosses again. But it was different now. They were a lot tougher, had new abilities, things just weren't the same. But I was still having a lot of fun, and plus I was way more confident because I had beaten them all before and I was ready to do it again. Okay, here we go, I did it all again, here we go Holy Pillar, let's end this. Nope, just kidding, you go back to the beginning yet again. And you know what I said? I said, bring it on, and I set out again. But this time, things weren't just a little different, they were a lot different. The bosses were starting to team up, and oh boy, if I thought the early game was hard, this is where the game really started to get difficult. I had enough trouble fighting bosses by themselves one at a time. Now when they're starting to team up and I had to fight 2 of them together, it was getting pretty rough. But by this point you have pretty much all of the asterisks leveled, so there's really nothing to fight to get stronger aside from the bosses themselves. The only way to progress is really coming up with a good enough strategy and composition. And it continues this way up until the end of the game, where you're fighting up to 5 of these bosses at the same time. It was incredibly awesome seeing them synergize together as I was my team. And they were really all felt like a genuine battle, with each one being more fun than the last. At this point, I was just along for the ride, and I was loving every single minute of it. It was getting back to the point where once again, I would be stuck on a boss fight for several days, and I would just be at school, and instead of paying attention to like learning or anything important, I would just be thinking of a way to beat the boss fight when I got home. I would just be sitting there, and then all of a sudden be like, I got it! And then I would race home to try out this new strategy. And whether it worked or if it didn't work, it was always just so fun. And once again, when I finally did manage to win, it was the most incredible feeling. And I finally beat the game. And I had never been so proud of myself for any video game accomplishment. I immediately booted up Bravely Second that same night, and well, the rest is history. Even to this day, everything, well almost everything that I love about RPGs can always be drawn back to Bravely Default. The customization, the vastness and sheer depth of the game systems, the focus on strong boss fights, the challenge, oh my god, the challenge. And while every year that passes and the more games I play, it becomes harder and harder to find myself as challenged in any kind of game, the better and better I get. And that's part of the reason I actually love Bravely Default 2 so much, because that game definitely scaled alongside me. I have this game to thank for literally showing me that yeah, I actually do love RPGs so much. I never would have played games that I nowadays love if I never got into the genre through this game. I for sure never would have played any of the other games on this list. That's for sure. And I know this last section of the video is kinda separate from the rest of the video, but I just wanted to share it, and show you all why I will play every single game that Team Asano is involved in, no matter what. I know this is the longest video I have ever put out by a large margin, so if you've made it to this point, I would just like to personally thank you. And once again, humbly ask that if you enjoyed the video, maybe leave a like, a comment, or maybe even subscribe. You can also find me on social media, my Twitter account, or you can even join the Discord, where we have a lot of fun. I'm excited to keep putting out videos for you guys, and I humbly ask that you await my next one. Have an epic day.